when the body stops asking permission. There is a moment when effort becomes embarrassing. You feel it in the chest before you can name it. The room is quiet. Shoes are by the door. The clock shows the same hour it always does. Your shoulders tense, waiting for a debate that no longer arrives. The body stands anyway. This is where willpower quietly exits. Most people believe discipline is fueled by desire. They watch themselves start strong, miss a morning, negotiate the next, then disappear without ceremony. The failure is private but familiar. Fingers scroll. Coffee cools. The plan is postponed with a thin excuse. No one sees it, yet it leaves a mark. The next invitation to begin again feels heavier. In older places, this pattern was understood without explanation. Monks moved before thought. Warriors tied their belts without asking how they felt. Not because they were strong, but because the question had been removed. The floor was cold. Knees touched it anyway. Breath steadied after resistance, not before. Others noticed the predictability and grew uneasy around it. When discipline replaces willpower, the shift is physical. The ache in the legs arrives on schedule. The pulse settles mid-motion. Words like later lose their grip. Social friction sharpens, friends joke, then stop inviting. Your routine becomes a quiet line you do not cross back over. If this feels uncomfortable, stay with it. Before you continue, write one habit you abandoned last year. One sentence. No explanation. Negotiation is where mornings go to die. He wakes before the alarm, eyes open to the dark. The ceiling is familiar. The body knows the hour. Then the pause. A shallow breath. The shoulders tighten as if bracing for a conversation that has already failed 100 times. Cold air sits in the lungs. The phone glows on the table. This is where most days quietly end, before they begin. The negotiation never sounds dramatic. It is polite. Reasonable. Just today. The legs feel heavy. The mouth is dry. Sleep would be efficient. Training can move to later. The body stays still while the mind speaks, and stillness begins to feel like consent. Somewhere nearby, shoes wait, untouched, and their silence feels like judgment. This is not weakness. It is repetition. The same inner exchange played so often it has worn a groove. Hands reach for the blanket the same way they once reached for the door. The spine curls. The pulse slows. Outside, nothing reacts. No consequence arrives. That absence teaches the wrong lesson, and the lesson settles into muscle memory. In temples and old training halls, this moment was treated as dangerous. Not because it felt bad, but because it felt normal. The floor was cold. Knees met it without ceremony. Breath counted itself back into order while the mind complained in the background. Others in the room moved at the same pace, faces neutral, making negotiation feel childish. Social pressure did not shout. It simply removed options. Modern rooms are quieter. You are alone with the bargain. The body waits for instruction it should never receive. Each delay trains it to ask again tomorrow. Each exception sharpens the voice of comfort. Friends laugh when you cancel, then expect it. Invitations soften. Your inconsistency becomes predictable, and predictability reshapes identity without asking permission. When discipline replaces willpower, this scene collapses. The negotiation is cut off mid-sentence. The belt is tied before the mind finishes its argument. Fingers fumble, stiff with cold, but they move. The floor chills the skin. Breath stutters, then steadies. The body acts first, and thought trails behind, annoyed and irrelevant. People notice this before you do. You leave gatherings early. You arrive at the same hour every day. Jokes turn into remarks. Remarks turn into silence. Your schedule becomes a line others hesitate to cross. This friction is not a reward. It is a signal that choice has begun to disappear. The danger is subtle. Miss this cut, and tomorrow you will negotiate again. Win it, and the body will remember. One path teaches debate. The other teaches movement. Only one survives repetition. The day choice quietly disappears. The room looks the same, but something is missing. The shoes are on before you notice the floor. Fingers tighten the laces with the same dull ache as yesterday. Cold skin, stiff joints, breath still shallow. Yet there is no pause this time. No inner meeting. The body has already moved past it. This is how choice erodes. Not with force, but with boredom. The mind tries to comment, arrives late, and finds nothing to argue with. The kettle boils. The mat waits. Knees lower onto it without ceremony. The chill rises through bone. A small exhale escapes, irritated, then settles. The body does what it has done too many times to question. Earlier versions of you needed reasons. They needed energy, inspiration, a clear mood. Now the absence of action feels louder than fatigue. Skipping feels wrong in the gut, like forgetting a name you should know. The shoulders tense not from effort, but from a mission. Something internal pulls forward, not to achieve, but to restore order. Others sense the shift before you name it. You stop explaining. You stop apologizing. When plans overlap, you leave. When asked why, you shrug. The answer would take too long and wouldn't land anyway. People read this as rigidity. Some smile thinly. Some stop asking. Social space rearranges itself around your refusal to negotiate. In older disciplines, this was the signal. Not mastery. Not confidence. The quiet removal of alternatives. Training began at the same hour. Weather was irrelevant. Injury changed intensity, not presence. A fever shortened the sit, but did not erase it. Continuity mattered more than comfort. The chain was protected at all costs, even when the link was weak. Your body learns this lesson faster than thought. It starts waking before alarms. Muscles warm mid-motion. The pulse finds rhythm sooner. Resistance still appears, but it has no microphone. It flickers, then fades. The work is already underway. What once required will now feels like gravity. This is not discipline as effort. This is discipline as environment. The night before decides the morning. Shoes placed by the door. Clothes folded the same way. The next move prepared so no decision remains. When the moment arrives, there is only execution. The mind watches, slightly offended, slightly relieved. The risk sharpens here. Break the chain, and choice rushes back in, eager and articulate. Protect it, and days begin to stack without friction. One path builds identity through debate. The other builds it through repetition. Only one survives distraction. Continuity is protected, not perfected. Some mornings arrive broken. The body knows it immediately. The legs feel dull, heavy from yesterday. Heat lingers behind the eyes. The breath is shorter than usual. In the past, this would have been evidence. Proof that today should be different. Proof that rest would be sensible. The mind still offers that argument, quietly, out of habit. The body ignores it. Intensity drops without discussion. Movements slow. The range shortens. Knees touch the mat and stay there longer. The floor is cold against skin that doesn't want it. A thin ache runs through the hips. None of this feels impressive. That is precisely why it works. The chain remains intact, even if the link is small. In older halls, this was understood as discipline's real test. Not the hard days, but the compromised ones. A monk with fever still sits, briefly. A warrior with injury practices footwork in place, barely lifting the heel. The session is reduced until it almost disappears, but it never vanishes. Continuity is guarded like a boundary stone. Cross it once, and the land changes hands. Modern failure hides inside perfection. Miss one day, and the mind declares the streak broken. Shoulders slump. The shoes stay by the door. I'll restart properly on Monday. The body hears something else, absence is allowed. That permission spreads. Tomorrow negotiates harder. The gap widens without noise. When discipline replaces willpower, the rule is simple and ruthless. The chain is never broken. It may thin. It may slow. It may look unimpressive to anyone watching. But it holds. The body learns that showing up is non-negotiable, while performance is flexible. This reverses the old hierarchy. Pride loosens. Identity hardens. Others don't always understand this version of you. They see you train lightly and assume laziness. They see you leave early and assume disinterest. You don't correct them. Explanation would invite debate, and debate reintroduces choice. Silence keeps the structure intact. Over time, something subtle shifts. Skipping begins to feel heavier than moving slowly. Doing less still satisfies the body's expectation. Doing nothing creates an itch that won't settle. The pulse remains uneven until motion resumes. Order restores itself through action, not intensity. This is where discipline stops being dramatic. There is no surge. No victory. Just a quiet relief when the body completes what it expects. The mind arrives afterward, late again, and searches for meaning where none is required. Break this rule, and tomorrow becomes a discussion. Protect it, and days connect into something solid. Not impressive. Not visible. But difficult to dismantle once it is in place. When obstacles appear, thinking fails first. The interruption never announces itself politely. Rain against the window. A late message. A schedule torn open without warning. The body pauses mid-motion, one shoe on, one still cold on the floor. The breath tightens. This is where most routines quietly dissolve, not from impact, but from hesitation. The old reflex reaches for thought. How bad is it? Can this move later? Is it still worth doing? The questions arrive fast, stacking on top of each other. Shoulders rise. Jaw tightens. The body waits for permission it should never request. In that waiting, momentum drains away. Older systems treated this moment as predictable. That was the point. When rain fell, training moved indoors without discussion. When exhaustion appeared, intensity dropped, not presence. When time collapsed, the next available slot was taken immediately, even if it was short and unsatisfying. Responses were pre-decided. Thought was unnecessary and therefore powerless. You begin to build these answers quietly. Shoes by the door mean you leave even if it's late. A mat rolled in the corner means you kneel when the plan breaks. A shortened sequence exists for days when energy is gone. The body recognizes these paths. The moment disruption appears, it steps onto the nearest one without waiting for approval. Social friction sharpens here. Others improvise their days and expect you to do the same. When you adjust without complaint, they notice. When you refuse to cancel, they question it. When you leave early to keep the chain intact, their faces shift. Some read this as obsession. Some as inflexibility. You read it as alignment. The body feels the difference immediately. Instead of tension, there is direction. The pulse steadies faster. Heat returns to the limbs. Even shortened work completes its arc, and the nervous system settles as if something overdue has been paid. The mind still complains, but its complaints have nowhere to land. This is not stubbornness. It is architecture. When obstacles appear, you do not decide. You execute the nearest valid action and move on. Decision-making is reserved for calm hours, not moments of pressure. This keeps the structure clean. This keeps discipline intact. Miss this, and every interruption becomes a debate. Win it, and interruptions lose their teeth. The world remains chaotic, but your response does not. The body trusts this consistency. Trust reduces resistance. Resistance fades sooner each time. Eventually, disruption becomes another cue. Rain means inside. Fatigue means slower. Delay means shorter. None of it means nothing. That word disappears from the system entirely. What remains is simple and dangerous. When something happens, you already know what follows. The mind arrives late again, looking for leverage, and finds the path already taken. The body moves before thought objects. One morning the resistance arrives late. You notice it only because it used to be louder. The eyes open. Light presses through the window. The floor is cold. Feet touch it without pause. Hands reach for clothes already folded. The breath is shallow, but it is moving. By the time the mind clears its throat to comment, the door is already open. This is not victory. It feels smaller than that. Almost disappointing. There is no surge, no internal speech. Just motion continuing because stopping would feel strange. The body has learned the sequence the way it learned to walk. You do not motivate yourself to stand. You stand. The shift is physical before it is conceptual. Muscles warm faster. The pulse finds rhythm sooner. The dull ache that used to argue now simply accompanies the movement, like weather. Thought trails behind, cataloging sensations it no longer controls. Its role has changed from commander to observer, and it does not like the demotion. Others notice the absence of drama. You don't hype yourself up. You don't complain. You don't announce discipline. You simply appear, repeat, leave. This unsettles people more than intensity ever did. Intensity invites comparison. Quiet consistency leaves nothing to compete with. Conversations thin. Expectations adjust. Inside, something locks. Skipping feels heavier than continuing. Not morally. Physically. The chest tightens when the pattern breaks. The breath won't settle. Sleep feels incomplete. Order is restored only after the body finishes what it expects. This expectation does not care about mood. It does not negotiate. It waits. Older systems understood this as the end of training and the beginning of being. A monk did not feel disciplined. He felt off when he wasn't sitting. A warrior did not feel driven. He felt misaligned when he wasn't practicing. The action had replaced the argument. Identity had replaced effort. This is where willpower becomes irrelevant. Not because you are strong, but because strength is no longer required. The path is worn. The edges are smooth. Even distraction cannot fully erase it. You might slow. You might shorten. You rarely stop. And when you do, the absence is loud enough to pull you back without force. The risk remains. Comfort returns disguised as flexibility. Others suggest easing up now that it's automatic. The body hears this as an invitation to forget. Forgetting always begins quietly. Remembering requires friction. For now, the body moves. Thought follows. The order holds. How long it holds depends on whether you protect what no longer asks for protection. When identity stops asking for proof. At some point, the question disappears. Not dramatically. It simply fails to arrive. You notice it only because the space where it used to sit feels empty. The body rises. The breath catches, then smooths. The floor is cold. Feet accept it without commentary. The sequence unfolds because it always has. This is not confidence. Confidence still watches itself. This is familiarity. The hands wrap the same way every time. The belt is tied before the mind checks in. Muscles complain, briefly, like an old reflex firing out of habit. Then they comply. The pulse steadies mid-motion. Order returns without ceremony. The world keeps offering alternatives. A softer morning. A skipped session framed as wisdom. Friends suggest balance with practiced concern. You feel these offers land in the body first. A faint tightening in the chest. A momentary drag in the step. Then nothing. The suggestion passes through without anchoring. Identity does not argue. It proceeds. Older disciplines marked this as a threshold. Not enlightenment. Not mastery. Simply the point where behavior no longer needed justification. A monk did not explain why he sat. A warrior did not defend why he trained. The action was not symbolic. It was maintenance. Like breathing. Like standing upright. You feel the shift when disruption stops feeling personal. Rain delays nothing. Fatigue adjusts pace, not presence. A missed hour slides into the next available space without resentment. The system absorbs impact and keeps moving. The body trusts this more than any promise you have ever made to yourself. Social consequences harden here. Your predictability becomes absolute. People stop testing it. Some distance themselves. Others orbit quietly, unsure where to enter. You notice the space and do not fill it. Filling would require explanation. Explanation would reopen the door to choice. Inside, there is less drama than expected. No pride. No relief. Just a steady neutrality when the pattern holds, and a sharp discomfort when it doesn't. Skipping feels like leaving a door open overnight. Nothing visibly wrong, but sleep is shallow until it's closed again. This is discipline as identity. Not something you summon, but something that resists being removed. Willpower would have burned out by now. Motivation would have wandered. This remains because it is no longer optional. The body expects it the way it expects gravity. The danger is subtle and permanent. Once identity forms, breaking it takes less effort than building it did. Neglect arrives dressed as flexibility. Comfort whispers that you've earned exception. The body hears that whisper clearly. What happens next depends on whether you treat identity as fixed, or as something that still requires protection. Discipline remains after willpower is gone. In the end, nothing dramatic announces itself. There is no finish line. No reward. Just a quiet recognition that something has settled into place. You wake. You move. The body completes what it expects before the mind has time to interfere. Cold air fills the lungs. Muscles respond without complaint. Order restores itself through action alone. This is where discipline reveals its true nature. Not as effort, but as gravity. Not as control, but as alignment. Willpower burned out long ago. Motivation stopped visiting. What remains does not argue with absence. It reacts to it. When the pattern breaks, the body feels it immediately. Sleep is thinner. The breath won't deepen. Rest arrives only after the chain is restored. Others see this and name it incorrectly. They call it rigid, extreme, unbalanced. They are responding to the pressure of something that does not move when asked. Your presence exposes how often most lives are negotiated. You do not correct them. Correction would require explanation. Explanation would reopen the door. This is discipline as identity. Not something you summon on good days, but something that resists being removed on bad ones. It exists because it has been repeated past the point of choice. It holds because breaking it now would feel like breaking bone, not habit. Nothing about this feels heroic. It feels inevitable. That is the point. If you are still here, make the cost visible. Comment one action you will perform daily, at a fixed hour, without explanation. One sentence. No context. Let the record exist. Discipline remains after willpower is gone. In the end, nothing dramatic announces itself. There is no finish line. No reward. Just a quiet recognition that something has settled into place. You wake. You move. The body completes what it expects before the mind has time to interfere. Cold air fills the lungs. Muscles respond without complaint. Order restores itself through action alone. This is where discipline reveals its true nature. Not as effort, but as gravity. Not as control, but as alignment. Willpower burned out long ago. Motivation stopped visiting. What remains does not argue with absence. It reacts to it. When the pattern breaks, the body feels it immediately. Sleep is thinner. The breath won't deepen. Rest arrives only after the chain is restored. Others see this and name it incorrectly. They call it rigid, extreme, unbalanced. They are responding to the pressure of something that does not move when asked. Your presence exposes how often most lives are negotiated. You do not correct them. Correction would require explanation. Explanation would reopen the door. This is discipline as identity. Not something you summon on good days, but something that resists being removed on bad ones. It exists because it has been repeated past the point of choice. It holds because breaking it now would feel like breaking bone, not habit. Nothing about this feels heroic. It feels inevitable. That is the point. If you are still here, make the cost visible. Comment one action you will perform daily, at a fixed hour, without explanation. One sentence. No context. Let the record exist.